The November wind cut through the high desert of northern Arizona like a cavalry saber, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of an early winter. Silas Maddox pulled his hat low against the stinging sand as his horse picked its way carefully down the rocky slope, searching for the 3 head of cattle that had wandered from his small herd during the night's dust storm. The sun hung merciless in the pale sky, beating down on the red earth with the intensity of a blacksmith's forge. Yet Silas knew that come nightfall, the temperature would drop enough to freeze a man's breath. This was the way of the high country, scorching by day, bitter by night, with nothing but the wind for company and the vast emptiness stretching to every horizon. His weathered hands guided the reins with practiced ease as he scanned the landscape for any sign of his missing stock. At 32, Silas had spent the better part of a decade learning to read this harsh country. First as a soldier in the territorial campaigns, then as a rancher trying to carve out a living from land that seemed determined to kill anything foolish enough to call it home. The creek bed he followed had been reduced to little more than a trickle by the late-season drought, its banks lined with the bleached bones of animals less fortunate than his own. It was there, near a cluster of drought-stunted cottonwoods, that something caught his eye, a flash of pale fabric against the rust-colored earth. Silas reined in his mount and dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravelly soil. What he'd taken for discarded cloth revealed itself to be something far more troubling. Dark stains marked the sand, too fresh to be anything but blood, and scattered nearby were torn pieces of blue calico and white muslin. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt, .45 at his hip as he followed the trail of disturbance. Someone or something had been here recently, and whatever had happened hadn't ended well. The tracks were confused, scuffed by wind and sand, but he could make out the impression of what might have been a woman's small boot print among them. 20 yards from the creek, partially buried beneath a drift of red sand and tumbleweeds, he found her. She lay on her side, one arm flung protectively over her face, her dark hair matted with dust and dried blood. Her dress, what remained of it, had been torn and shredded, whether by thorns, rough treatment, or the fierce wind. He couldn't tell. Her legs were scratched and bloodied, her feet bare and cut from walking over the unforgiving ground. Silas knelt beside her, pressing 2 fingers to the pulse point at her throat. The heartbeat was weak but steady, and her breathing, though shallow, was regular. She was alive, but barely. In this country, that might not last long. He studied her face, trying to gauge her age and condition. She was young, perhaps 25 or so, with delicate features that spoke of a gentler life than the one that had brought her to this desolate place. Her skin, though weathered by exposure, had the pale quality of someone unaccustomed to the harsh desert sun. "Ma'am," he called softly, brushing sand from her cheek. "Can you hear me?" She didn't respond, though her eyelids fluttered slightly at his touch. Silas looked around the empty landscape, weighing his options. Leaving her here meant certain death, if the exposure didn't take her. The coyotes would, but bringing her back to his cabin meant complications he wasn't sure he was prepared to handle. The decision made itself when a gust of wind sent another wave of stinging sand across the creek bed. Silas shrugged out of his heavy wool coat and wrapped it around the unconscious woman, lifting her as gently as he could manage. She was lighter than he'd expected, her body having the hollow feel of someone who hadn't eaten well in some time. His horse, a steady roan gelding named Buck, shifted nervously as Silas approached with his burden. "Easy, boy," he murmured, adjusting his grip on the woman to mount while holding her secure against his chest. "Just a little extra cargo for the ride home." The cabin sat in a natural clearing about 2 miles deeper into the hills, surrounded by pine and juniper trees that provided some shelter from the worst of the wind. It was a modest structure, 2 rooms, a stone chimney, and a covered porch, but it was solid and warm, and it had been home for the past 3 years. It had been Gideon's place first. Silas tried not to think about his brother as he carried the unconscious woman through the front door. The cabin still held traces of Gideon's presence, his favorite coffee cup on the kitchen shelf, his extra pair of boots by the door. the daguerreotype portrait of their parents on the mantelpiece. Silas had never found the heart to pack those things away, though looking at them never failed to bring back the ache of loss. He laid the woman on the narrow bed in what had been Gideon's room, the same bed where his brother had slept during his brief visits home from his service with the Union Army. The irony wasn't lost on him. Another lost soul seeking shelter in a place marked by death and sorrow. The fire in the main room had burned down to embers, so Silas set about building it back up, feeding dried pine and oak to the flames until the cabin began to warm. He put water onto heat and rummaged through his limited medical supplies, mostly horse liniment and a bottle of whiskey, with some clean rags and a needle and thread for the worst emergencies. When he returned to check on his unexpected guest, she was shivering despite the coat wrapped around her. Her lips had taken on a bluish tinge, and her breathing seemed more labored than before. Hypothermia, most likely, combined with exhaustion and whatever injuries she'd sustained. Silas worked quickly, cleaning the worst of the cuts on her feet and legs, checking for broken bones or other serious damage. Aside from the scratches and what would certainly be impressive bruises, she seemed to have escaped any life-threatening injuries. Her greatest enemy now was the cold and the shock her body had endured. He brought her a cup of warm broth made from the last of his beef jerky, lifting her head gently to help her take small sips. Most of it ran down her chin, but some seemed to find its way down her throat. It was the best he could manage for now. As the evening shadows lengthened across the cabin floor, Silas found himself keeping vigil beside the bed, adding wood to the fire and listening to the wind howl around the eaves. He'd grown accustomed to solitude in the years since Gideon's death, finding a measure of peace in the isolation of the high country. The presence of another person, especially a woman, felt strange and unsettling. It was well past midnight when she began to stir. At first, it was just restless movement, her head turning on the pillow, her hands clutching at the blankets. Then came the soft murmurs, words too indistinct to understand. Silas leaned forward in his chair, trying to make sense of what she was saying. Suddenly, her eyes snapped open, wide and unseeing in the flickering firelight. She sat bolt upright in the bed, her face a mask of terror, and let out a scream that seemed to tear from the very depths of her soul. "Gideon," she cried, her voice raw with anguish. "Don't leave me. Please don't leave me." The name hit Silas like a physical blow, driving the breath from his lungs and sending ice through his veins. He stared at the woman as she collapsed back onto the pillow, her outburst having exhausted what little strength she'd regained. Her eyes fluttered closed again, but her lips continued to move, forming that impossible name over and over. "Gideon." Silas rose slowly from his chair and walked to the fireplace, his legs unsteady beneath him. The daguerreotype of his brother sat on the mantel where it had always been, Gideon in his Union blue, young and confident, with that cocky smile that had charmed half the girls in 3 counties. Dead these 3 years, killed in some nameless skirmish in the New Mexico territory while fighting Apache raiders. How could this woman know his name? Who was she? And what connection could she possibly have to his dead brother? Silas looked back at the bed where she lay sleeping fitfully, her dark hair spread across Gideon's pillow like a shadow. The unease that had been growing in his chest since he'd found her now blossomed into something deeper and more troubling. Nothing about this situation made sense, and, in his experience, coincidences in this harsh country were usually anything but coincidental. The wind continued to moan around the cabin as Silas settled back into his chair to wait for dawn, and for answers that he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. Dawn came gray and cold, bringing with it the distant rumble of thunder from storm clouds gathering over the mountain peaks. Silas had dozed fitfully in his chair through the night, starting awake each time the woman stirred or called out that cursed name. Now, as pale light filtered through the cabin's single window, he found her watching him with eyes the color of storm-dark sky. She sat up slowly, wincing as the movement pulled at her injuries, and clutched the blanket to her chest. Her gaze darted around the unfamiliar room, taking in the rough-hewn walls, the simple furniture, and finally settling on Silas with a mixture of wariness and confusion. "Where am I?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, hoarse from her ordeal and the night's crying out. "My cabin," Silas replied, setting down the cup of coffee he'd been nursing. "About 15 miles north of Prescott, up in the high country. Found you yesterday by Willow Creek, half buried in sand." She pressed a hand to her forehead, as if trying to recall how she'd come to be there. I don't remember much. There was a storm, and I was trying to find shelter." "What's your name?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. She stared at him for a long moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Evelyn," she said finally. "Evelyn Rose." "Well, Miss Rose, you're lucky to be alive. Another few hours out there and the cold would have finished what the desert started." He stood and moved to the stove, ladling warm oatmeal into a bowl. "You need to eat something. Build your strength back up." But as he approached the bed with the food, she shrank back against the headboard, her eyes wide with a sudden panic. "Please," she whispered. "I need to go. I can't stay here." "You're not going anywhere, not with your feet cut up like that and a storm coming in." Silas set the bowl on the bedside table and stepped back, giving her space. "Besides, where would you go? Nearest town's a hard day's ride, and that's if a man knows the way." Evelyn looked toward the window, where the first fat snowflakes were beginning to fall against the glass. The sight seemed to drain what little color remained in her cheeks. "How long until the storm passes?" "Could be days, could be a week. Winter storms up here don't follow any man's schedule." Silas returned to his chair, keeping his distance but watching her carefully. "You're safe here, Miss Rose. I give you my word on that." She studied his face as if trying to judge the truth of his statement. Whatever she saw there must have reassured her somewhat, because she reached tentatively for the bowl of oatmeal and began to eat with small, careful bites. The snow continued to fall throughout the morning, transforming the world outside into a white wilderness. By afternoon, it was coming down so thick that Silas could barely see the wood pile 20 feet from the cabin door. He busied himself with the routine tasks of winter preparation, bringing in extra firewood, checking the food stores, ensuring the small stable where Buck was sheltered had adequate hay and grain. Evelyn remained in bed for most of that first day, sleeping off and on, though he noticed she started awake frequently, as if troubled by dreams. When she was awake, she watched him with those dark eyes, saying little but taking in everything. There was an alertness about her that suggested a woman accustomed to watching for danger. On the second day, she insisted on getting up despite his protests about her injured feet. She wrapped them in torn strips of cloth and moved carefully around the cabin, examining everything with the thoroughness of someone cataloging potential threats and exits. "You live here alone?" she asked, running her fingers over the dust that had accumulated on Gideon's coffee cup. "For the past 3 years," Silas confirmed, not missing how her hand lingered on his brother's belongings. "It's a hard country for anyone, but it suits me well enough." She picked up the daguerreotype from the mantel, studying the face in the faded image. "Who is this?" Silas felt his jaw tighten. "My brother. He looks like you," she observed, though her voice carried an odd quality, as if she were testing the words. "What happened to him?" "Killed in the territory campaigns, fighting raiders down in New Mexico. 3 years ago this spring." Evelyn set the photograph down carefully, but not before Silas caught the slight tremor in her hands. "I'm sorry for your loss." He nodded curtly, unwilling to pursue that particular conversation. "You said you don't remember much about how you came to be by the creek. What do you remember?" She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, it was while staring out at the falling snow. "I was traveling with someone, a man I thought I could trust. We were heading north, looking for work, maybe homestead land." Her voice grew smaller. "There were other men, rough men. They wanted things we couldn't give." "What happened to your traveling companion?" "He ran." The words came out flat and bitter. "Left me to fend for myself when those men came calling. I managed to get away. but I've been wandering for days, maybe weeks. It all runs together after a while." Silas watched her profile as she spoke, noting the way she held herself rigid, as if braced against painful memories. He'd seen that same posture in men who'd lived through battles, who'd learned that the world could turn vicious without warning. On the third day, Evelyn began to help with the household tasks. Despite his protests that she should rest, she insisted on contributing what she could. She swept the floors with careful, deliberate strokes, washed their few dishes in heated water, and mended a tear in one of his shirts with neat, precise stitches that spoke of considerable skill with a needle. "You don't have to do all this," Silas told her as she knelt by the fireplace, carefully folding his clean laundry. "I've been managing well enough on my own. I need to earn my keep," she replied without looking up. "I won't be beholden to any man's charity." There was a pride in her voice that he recognized, the fierce independence of someone who'd learned to rely only on themselves. It was a quality he understood, having cultivated it himself since Gideon's death. But as the days passed and the storm showed no signs of abating, Silas found himself increasingly aware of her presence in ways that had nothing to do with gratitude or Christian duty. The way she moved around the cabin with quiet grace, the sound of her humming softly while she worked, the sight of her dark hair catching the firelight when she bent over her mending, all of it stirred something in him that he'd thought buried along with his brother. It had been a long time since he'd shared his space with another person, longer still since that person had been a woman. The enforced intimacy of the storm-bound cabin created a tension that seemed to grow thicker with each passing day. He found himself watching the curve of her neck as she washed dishes, the way her lips pursed in concentration when she sewed, the gentle sway of her hips as she moved about her tasks. It was on the fourth night that the nightmares returned. Silas jerked awake in his bed in the cabin's main room to the sound of Evelyn crying out from Gideon's old room. At first, it was just wordless sounds of distress, but as he lay listening, the words became clearer. "Don't die," she sobbed, her voice thick with tears. "Please don't die. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." And then, like a knife through his heart, "Gideon, please, don't leave me alone." Silas sat up in bed, his pulse hammering in his ears. The sound of her weeping filled the small cabin, raw and heartbroken. The grief of someone who'd lost everything that mattered. He rose and padded quietly to the doorway of her room, where he could see her thrashing in the bed, caught in the grip of whatever demons haunted her sleep. "Miss Rose," he called softly. "Evelyn, wake up." Her eyes snapped open, wide and unseeing in the darkness. For a moment, she stared at him as if he were a stranger, or perhaps a ghost. Then awareness returned, and she pressed her hands to her face, trying to hide the tears that continued to flow. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to wake you." Silas stepped into the room, keeping his distance but unable to simply walk away from her obvious distress. "You called out a name, Gideon. Do you know someone by that name?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from the dying fire. Evelyn's hands fell away from her face, and he could see her struggling with something, memory, perhaps, or the decision of how much truth to reveal. I'm not sure," she said finally. "Sometimes I dream about things, people. It might not mean anything. You've called that name before, the first night you were here." She looked away, unable or unwilling to meet his eyes. "My memory isn't clear about a lot of things. The shock, the cold, it's all mixed up in my head." Silas studied her face in the dim light, noting the way she avoided his gaze, the tension in her shoulders that suggested she was hiding something important. But pushing her now, when she was already fragile and frightened, seemed cruel. "Try to get some rest," he said finally. "The storm should break soon, and then we can talk about what comes next." As he turned to leave, her voice stopped him at the threshold. "Silas?" He looked back to find her watching him with those dark, troubled eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For everything. I know I'm not. I know this situation isn't easy for you." He nodded once and returned to his own bed. But sleep was a long time coming. Outside, the wind continued to howl around the cabin's eaves, and in his mind, he couldn't stop hearing her call his dead brother's name with such heartbreaking familiarity. Whatever connection existed between Evelyn Rose and Gideon, whatever secrets she carried in her damaged memory, Silas knew he would have to learn the truth, the alternative. Living with the questions and the growing attraction he felt for a woman who might have been his brother's lover was impossible to bear. The storm finally broke on the 6th day, leaving behind a world transformed by pristine snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds in the morning sun. Silas emerged from the cabin to find the drifts piled nearly to his waist in places, the familiar landscape rendered strange and beautiful by winter's hand. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional crack of settling timber and the distant cry of a hawk circling high above the white-mantled pines. Inside, Evelyn stood at the window watching him clear a path to the woodpile, her breath fogging the glass as she observed his methodical work. When he returned, stamping snow from his boots, he found her preparing breakfast with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown in all her domestic tasks. "The worst has passed," he announced, hanging his coat on its peg by the door. "Roads will be impassable for a few days yet, but the sky's clear." She nodded without turning from the stove, but he caught the slight stiffening of her shoulders at the implication. Soon, very soon, she would have to make decisions about where to go and what to do with her life. It was over breakfast that she began to speak more freely about her past, though Silas sensed she was still holding back crucial details. "I lived in a settlement near the border," she said, stirring her coffee absently. "It wasn't much of a place, just a collection of families trying to make do with land that didn't want to be farmed. Drought took most of the crops 2 years running, and people started drifting away, looking for better prospects." "What about your family?" A shadow passed across her features. "Dead. Fever took them the winter before last. I was on my own, trying to decide whether to stay and hope things got better or pack up and head north like everyone else. And you chose to leave. I chose to trust the wrong person." Her voice carried a bitterness that spoke of hard-learned lessons. "There was a man who came through town, said he knew of work up in Colorado territory, maybe even California. He seemed respectable, said he'd been a soldier, knew how to handle trouble if it came up." Silas felt something cold settle in his stomach. A soldier? Yes, though he never said which outfit he'd served with, just that he'd done his duty during the war. She looked up from her coffee, meeting his eyes for the first time that morning. He wore his hair long, like a lot of men do who've left the service behind. Said the uniform reminded him of things he'd rather forget. "Can you describe him?" Evelyn's brow furrowed in concentration. "Tall, maybe your height, light hair, blue eyes. He had a scar here." She touched her left cheek, just below the eye. "Said he got it from a saber cut during a cavalry charge. He seemed kind at first, protective. I thought—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "I thought he genuinely cared about my welfare, but he didn't. No." The word came out flat and final. "When those men found our camp, when they made it clear what they wanted, he didn't hesitate, just mounted his horse and rode off into the night. Left me to face them alone." Silas studied her face, noting the way her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "How did you get away?" "I grabbed what I could carry and ran into the desert. They followed for a while, but I guess they decided I wasn't worth the trouble once I got into the rough country." She met his eyes again. "I've been wandering ever since, trying to find somewhere safe to rest." The story had the ring of truth to it, but Silas couldn't shake the feeling that she was editing out crucial details. The man she described could have been any of thousands of former soldiers drifting through the territories. But something about her manner when she spoke of him suggested a deeper connection than mere traveling companions. As the days passed and the snow began to melt under the strengthening sun, Evelyn settled into the rhythm of cabin life with an ease that both comforted and unsettled Silas. She tended a small garden patch he'd managed to keep protected under an improvised lean-to, coaxing hardy winter vegetables from the frozen ground with patient skill. She split kindling with an accuracy that spoke of long practice, and mended his clothes with the kind of careful attention that transformed mere repairs into improvements. Most remarkably, she seemed to be making the cabin into something more like a home than it had been since Gideon's death. Small touches appeared throughout the rooms, wildflowers in a jar on the table despite the season, his few books arranged neatly on their shelf, the rough wooden surfaces polished until they gleamed in the firelight. It was as if she were trying to build something lasting, to put down roots in a place that had known too much loneliness. The realization troubled Silas more than he cared to admit. He found himself watching her as she moved through these domestic routines, noting the way her face relaxed when she was absorbed in her work, the soft humming that sometimes accompanied her tasks, the graceful efficiency of her movements. She was beautiful in a quiet way that grew more apparent the longer he observed her, not the flashy prettiness of saloon girls or the pampered beauty of town ladies, but something deeper and more enduring. He was falling for her, and the knowledge sat in his chest like a stone. The awareness became impossible to ignore one evening as they sat by the fire after supper. Evelyn had been mending a tear in one of his shirts, her needle flashing in and out of the fabric with practiced precision, when she suddenly looked up to find him watching her. "What is it?" she asked, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Nothing," he said, but made no effort to look away. "Just, you look content." "I am?" The words seemed to surprise her as much as they did him. "It's been a long time since I felt safe enough to be content." The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, an owl called from somewhere in the darkness, its voice lonely and wild. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken possibilities, until Silas found himself rising from his chair and crossing to where she sat. "Evelyn," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. She set aside her mending and looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. There was something in her expression, a vulnerability mixed with longing that made his pulse quicken. "I know this is complicated," he continued, settling into the chair beside hers. "I know you've been through things that would break most people, but I want you to know that you're welcome here, for as long as you want to stay." Her breath caught slightly. "Silas, you don't understand." "I understand enough." He reached out, covering her hand with his. "I understand that you're alone, that you've been hurt by people you trusted. I understand that this place has given you some peace, and that maybe we could both benefit from not being alone anymore." She stared down at their joined hands, and he could see the conflict playing across her features. "There are things about my past, about who I was before, that you don't know." "Then tell me." For a moment, he thought she might. Her lips parted as if she were about to speak, but then she shook her head. "I can't, not yet." "Why not?" "Because you'll hate me." The words came out as barely a whisper. "Because when you know the truth, you'll understand that I don't deserve kindness from anyone, least of all from you." Before he could respond, she pulled her hand free and rose abruptly from her chair. "I should check the fire in the other room," she said, but instead of moving toward Gideon's old bedroom, she remained standing by the hearth, her back to him. Silas stood as well, drawn by something he couldn't name. "Evelyn." She turned at the sound of his voice, and he saw tears glistening in her eyes. Without quite knowing how it happened, he found himself reaching for her, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that belied the turmoil in his chest. "Whatever it is," he said quietly, "it doesn't matter. Not anymore." She closed her eyes at his touch, leaning into his palms as if she were drowning and he was her only anchor. "It does matter," she whispered. "It matters more than you could ever know." But when she opened her eyes and looked at him, he saw not just sorrow, but something else, a hunger that matched his own, a desperate need for connection that had been too long denied. The space between them seemed to collapse, and then he was kissing her, tasting the salt of her tears and the sweetness beneath. She responded with a fervor that surprised them both, her arms winding around his neck, her body pressing against his with an urgency that spoke of months or even years of loneliness. The kiss deepened, became something wild and desperate, as if they were both trying to lose themselves in the simple human need for touch and comfort. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Silas rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he said simply. "Whatever happened before, whatever you're running from, stay here with me." Evelyn's eyes searched his face, and for a moment he thought she would agree. But then something shifted in her expression, a shadow of the guilt and fear that haunted her, and she stepped back. "I need time," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. "Please, Silas, I need time to think." He wanted to argue, to press her for the truth he could see she was hiding, but the fragile trust between them felt too precious to risk. Instead, he nodded and stepped back, giving her the space she needed. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." But as she retreated to Gideon's room and closed the door quietly behind her, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that whatever secrets Evelyn carried would soon force a reckoning that would change everything between them. He remained by the dying fire long into the night, staring at the daguerreotype of his brother and wondering what Gideon would think of the woman now sleeping in his bed, the woman who called his name in her dreams with such heartbreaking familiarity. The morning after their kiss dawned cold and brittle, with a tension that seemed to permeate every corner of the small cabin. Evelyn avoided Silas's eyes as she prepared breakfast, moving through her tasks with mechanical precision, while he watched her with a mixture of longing and frustration that made his chest ache. They spoke only when necessary, requests to pass the salt, observations about the weather, practical matters that required no emotion or vulnerability. But beneath the careful politeness, Silas could feel something building, a pressure that would eventually demand release. It was on the second day of this strained civility that he made his decision. While Evelyn tended to her small garden, carefully brushing snow from the hardy winter greens that had somehow survived the storm, Silas retreated to the cabin's back room where he stored his few personal belongings. The trunk sat in the corner, its leather straps cracked with age and its brass fittings tarnished green. He hadn't opened it since the day he'd moved into Gideon's cabin, hadn't been able to face the memories contained within. But now, driven by questions that demanded answers, he lifted the heavy lid and began to sort through the remnants of his brother's life. Gideon's military papers were on top, his enlistment documents, commendations for bravery, the official notification of his death that had arrived 3 months after the fact. Beneath those were letters, dozens of them, written in Gideon's familiar scrawling hand during his years of service in the territorial campaigns. Silas had read some of them before, shortly after the funeral, but grief had made the words blur together into a meaningless catalog of military movements and complaints about army food. Now, he read them with a different purpose, searching for any mention of a woman, any clue that might explain Evelyn's connection to his brother. The early letters were exactly what he'd expected, accounts of marches and skirmishes, descriptions of the harsh beauty of the New Mexico landscape, complaints about incompetent officers and requests for news from home. But as Silas worked his way deeper into the stack, he began to notice changes in Gideon's tone, references that hadn't registered during his first reading. A letter dated 18 months before Gideon's death mentioned the settlement families who've been displaced by the fighting. Another, written 3 months later, spoke of the responsibility we bear for those caught between armies, especially the women and children who have no protectors. It was in a letter dated almost exactly 2 years before Gideon's death that Silas found the first direct reference. "There's a girl here, Silas, one of the refugees from a burned-out settlement near the border. She's got courage enough for 10 men and a spirit that won't be broken, no matter what this country throws at her. Her name is Evelyn Rose, and I swear she's got the prettiest brown hair you ever saw, like chestnuts fresh from the fire. She's been helping Doc Patterson with the wounded, working day and night without complaint. I've never met anyone quite like her. The letter slipped from Silas's numb fingers as the implications crashed over him like an avalanche. Evelyn Rose, the same name, the same woman, sleeping in his brother's bed and calling out Gideon's name in her dreams. She hadn't been traveling with some unnamed soldier. She'd been Gideon's woman, and she'd lied to him about it. With shaking hands, he picked up the letter and continued reading. I know you'll probably think I've lost my mind, writing about a girl like some lovesick boy, but there's something about her that makes a man want to be better than he is. She's educated, can read and write better than most men I know, and she's got opinions about everything from politics to poetry. We talk for hours when my duties allow, and I find myself looking forward to those conversations more than I should. The next letter, written 2 weeks later, was even more revealing. I'm going to marry her. Silas. I know that sounds sudden, but out here, with death around every corner, a man learns not to waste time on maybe and someday. Evelyn feels the same way. We've talked about it, and she's agreed to be my wife as soon as this campaign is over. I wanted you to be the first to know, because I'm hoping you'll welcome her into the family when I bring her home to Arizona. But there was no mention of a wedding in the subsequent letters, and as Silas read on, he began to understand why. The tone of Gideon's correspondence grew increasingly urgent as reports of Apache raids intensified. Military operations became more dangerous, more scattered, and the references to Evelyn became less frequent, though no less affectionate when they appeared. The final letter, dated just 3 weeks before the official notification of Gideon's death, was brief and hurried. The situation here has gone to hell. Silas, we're being hit almost daily, and command keeps splitting us into smaller units to cover more ground. It's a fool's strategy, but I'm just a sergeant, not a general. If something happens to me, I need you to know that Evelyn is the finest woman I've ever met, and I love her more than my own life. If she ever finds her way to you, I'm asking you as my brother to take care of her. She's been through more than anyone should have to bear, and she deserves whatever happiness this world can offer. Silas set the letter aside with careful deliberation, his hands steadier now despite the storm of emotions raging in his chest. The pieces were falling into place with terrible clarity. Evelyn's nightmares, her familiarity with his brother's belongings, the way she'd settled into the cabin as if she belonged there. She had belonged there. This was supposed to have been her home. But why had she lied to him? Why pretend not to know Gideon when his name clearly caused her such pain? The sound of the cabin door opening interrupted his thoughts, and he quickly gathered the letters back into their bundle. When Evelyn appeared in the main room, her cheeks flushed from the cold air and her arms full of vegetables for their evening meal, he was sitting by the fire with a book in his hands, the picture of casual domesticity. The turnips are doing better than I expected, she said, settling her harvest on the kitchen table. And there might be enough potatoes for a proper stew tonight. That sounds fine, Silas replied, not trusting himself to say more. He watched her move around the kitchen, noting details he'd missed before, the way she automatically reached for the spice jar that Gideon had always kept on the highest shelf, the practiced ease with which she operated the finicky latch on the larder door, the unconscious familiarity she showed with every aspect of the cabin's layout. Of course she knew where everything was. She'd planned to live here. As the afternoon wore on, Silas found himself studying Evelyn with new eyes, looking for signs of the deception she'd practiced so skillfully. But if anything, she seemed more troubled than usual, jumping at unexpected sounds and casting nervous glances toward the windows as if expecting unwelcome visitors. It was while she was preparing dinner that she noticed the daguerreotype. Silas had left it propped against a book on the mantelpiece, angled so that it caught the firelight, and he watched her reaction carefully as she spotted it. Her hands stilled on the knife she'd been using to slice vegetables, and her face went pale as winter moonlight. For a long moment, she simply stared at the photograph, her breathing shallow and rapid. Then, moving like a woman in a dream, she set down the knife and walked slowly to the fireplace. With trembling fingers, she picked up the daguerreotype and held it close to the light, A sound escaped her then, half sob, half sigh, and tears began to flow down her cheeks in silent streams. "Gideon," she whispered, so softly that Silas almost didn't hear it. But he did hear it, and the raw pain in her voice confirmed everything he'd learned from his brother's letters. "You know him," Silas said quietly, rising from his chair. It wasn't a question. Evelyn spun around. The photograph clutched against her chest, her eyes wide with panic. For a moment, she looked like a cornered animal, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. She began, then stopped, her throat working as if the words were physically painful to speak. "His name was Gideon Maddox," Silas continued, moving closer but keeping his voice gentle. "He was my brother, and you're the woman he wrote to me about, the woman he wanted to marry." The photograph slipped from Evelyn's nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor as she sank to her knees. The sobs came then, great heaving gasps that shook her entire frame, and Silas found himself kneeling beside her, gathering her into his arms despite the anger and confusion warring in his chest. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Why lie about knowing him?" She pressed her face against his shoulder, her tears soaking through his shirt. "Because I killed him," she choked out between sobs. "Because it's my fault he's dead, and I knew if you found out, you'd hate me as much as I hate myself." The words hit Silas like physical blows, but he didn't let go of her. Instead, he held her tighter, rocking slightly as she wept against him. "Tell me," he said simply. "Tell me what happened." For several minutes, the only sounds in the cabin were her ragged breathing and the crackle of the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was muffled against his chest, but every word was clear. "We were going to be married," she said. "As soon as his enlistment was up, we were going to come here, to this cabin, and start a life together. He had it all planned out, how we'd expand the house, where we'd plant crops, how many children we wanted." She pulled back slightly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. But then the raids got worse, and his unit was ordered to escort a supply train through hostile territory. He asked me to wait at the settlement, said it was too dangerous for civilians to come along, but I followed anyway. I thought if I was there, I could help if anyone got hurt." Silas felt cold dread settling in his stomach. "What happened?" "Apache raiders hit the train at dawn, just like Gideon had feared they would. But instead of running, instead of staying hidden like he'd told me to, I tried to help. I saw him fighting 3 warriors at once, and I couldn't just watch." Her voice broke again. "I ran toward him, screaming his name, trying to distract his attackers. But all I did was distract him instead." She met Silas's eyes then, and he saw the full weight of her guilt reflected there. He turned when he heard me scream, just for a second, but it was enough. One of the warriors got past his guard, and... She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. "That's why you blame yourself," Silas said, understanding flooding through him. "That's why you think you killed him." "I did kill him," she said fiercely. "If I'd stayed away, if I'd done what he asked, he'd still be alive. He died because he loved me, because he couldn't ignore my voice even in the middle of a fight. That's not something you forgive. Silas, that's not something you forget." The cabin fell silent around them, the weight of her confession settling between them like a stone. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the windows and sending snow crystals against the glass like thrown sand. Finally, Silas spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "Is that why you came here? To find me?" She shook her head. "I didn't even know you existed until I saw his picture on the mantel. Gideon mentioned a brother in his letters, but I was so lost in my grief after he died that I barely registered the details. I wandered for months, maybe years. It all blurs together. I only ended up here by accident, running from those men I told you about." "The men who attacked you, they were real?" "Oh, yes," she said bitterly. "Apparently, I attract violence wherever I go. First Gideon, then them. It seems to be my particular talent." Silas reached out and tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his eyes. Evelyn, listen to me. What happened to Gideon wasn't your fault. He was a soldier, and soldiers die in battle. It's the risk every man accepts when he puts on the uniform. You don't understand. I understand perfectly, he said firmly. I understand that you loved him, and that he loved you. I understand that you were trying to help, not hurt him, and I understand that you've been carrying guilt that doesn't belong to you. She stared at him, something like hope flickering in her dark eyes. How can you say that? How can you not hate me? Because hating you won't bring Gideon back, Silas said simply, and because I think he'd want me to take care of you, just like he asked me to in his last letter. The hope in her eyes flared brighter, but then dimmed again as another thought occurred to her. His last letter? He wrote to me about you many times. He loved you, Evelyn, and he wanted you to be part of our family. Silas paused, choosing his next words carefully. The question now is whether you can forgive yourself enough to accept that. Before she could answer, the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the clearing outside, followed by rough voices and the jingle of harness. Silas and Evelyn froze, looking at each other with sudden alarm. "Stay here," Silas whispered, reaching for the rifle that hung above the fireplace. "And whatever happens, don't let them see you." But as he moved toward the window to peer out at their unexpected visitors, he couldn't shake the feeling that their fragile moment of truth had come too late, that the past Evelyn had been running from had finally caught up with them both. The hoofbeats faded into the distance as quickly as they had come, leaving behind only the whisper of wind through the pines and the rapid beating of two hearts. Silas lowered his rifle and stepped back from the window, his shoulders sagging with relief. "False alarm," he said, turning to find Evelyn still crouched beside the fireplace where she'd taken cover. "Just travelers passing through, probably heading for the main road to Prescott." But the interruption had shattered the fragile intimacy of their moment, and as Evelyn rose slowly to her feet, Silas could see her retreating behind the walls she'd built around her heart. The vulnerability she'd shown while confessing her connection to Gideon was gone, replaced by the guarded wariness he'd come to recognize as her default state. "We should eat," she said quietly, returning to the kitchen as if nothing had happened. "The stew will be ready soon." They ate in silence, the weight of everything spoken and unspoken hanging between them like smoke. Silas found himself studying her face in the flickering candlelight, noting the way she avoided his eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the careful distance she maintained even while sitting at the same small table. It was only after they'd cleared the dishes and settled by the fire that she finally spoke again. "You said Gideon wrote to you about me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did he tell you?" Silas considered his words carefully. "That he loved you, that he wanted to marry you and bring you here to live, that you were the finest woman he'd ever met." A tear slipped down her cheek, catching the firelight. "He was going to build me a garden," she said, "right where that patch of vegetables is now. He said I could grow anything I wanted, that we'd have fresh flowers on the table every day if that's what made me happy. You could still have that garden," Silas said gently. "You could still have the life he wanted to give you." She shook her head, fresh tears flowing freely now. "Not without him. Don't you see? This was supposed to be our home, our life together. How can I live in the place he built for me when he's not here to share it? Because that's what he would have wanted." Silas replied, "Because throwing your life away won't honor his memory or bring him back. You make it sound so simple. Nothing about this is simple." He leaned forward in his chair, willing her to look at him. "But I know my brother, Evelyn. I know he wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. Finally, Evelyn spoke, her voice so soft he had to strain to hear her. "Tell me about him," she said. "Tell me what he was like before the war, before I met him. I only knew him as a soldier, always looking over his shoulder, always ready to ride out at a moment's notice. But there must have been more to him than that." Silas smiled, the first genuine smile he had worn since finding Gideon's letters. He was trouble from the day he could walk, he said. Always getting into scrapes, always convinced he could talk his way out of whatever mess he'd created. Our mother used to say he could charm the birds from the trees if he set his mind to it. That sounds like him, Evelyn said, a ghost of a smile touching her own lips. He could make me laugh even when everything seemed hopeless. He was brave, too, but not in the way people think of soldiers' bravery. He was brave enough to care about people, to put himself on the line for anyone who needed help. That's why he joined the army in the first place. Not for glory or adventure, but because he thought it was his duty to protect folks who couldn't protect themselves. Like the families at the settlement. Like you, Silas said quietly. He saw you needed protection, needed someone to care about you, and he couldn't walk away from that. It wasn't in his nature. Evelyn was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. I loved him so much. Silas, I loved him more than I thought it was possible to love another person. When he died, when I watched him fall, I felt like part of my soul was being ripped away. I know. Do you? Do you really? She turned to face him fully for the first time that evening. Because sometimes I think the grief is going to kill me. Sometimes I lie awake at night and I can still hear his voice, still feel his hands touching me, and I wonder if I'm going insane. Silas reached across the space between them and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. You're not going insane. You're mourning. There's a difference. Is there? Because right now, sitting here with you in the house he built for me, I can't tell the difference between memory and madness. Tell me about the good times, Silas said. Tell me about when you were happy together. A real smile broke across her face then, transforming her features with its radiance. He used to bring me wildflowers, she said. Whatever he could find growing in that harsh country, desert marigolds, Indian paintbrush, prickly pear blossoms. He said every woman deserved flowers, even in the middle of nowhere. That sounds like something he'd do. And he sang to me, badly. Mind you, he couldn't carry a tune to save his life, but he sang anyway. Old folk songs our mother had taught him, hymns from church, sometimes songs he made up on the spot about whatever we were doing that day. She laughed, the sound bright and musical in the small cabin. I used to tease him about it, tell him he was scaring the horses with his awful singing. What did he say to that? That the horses didn't know good music when they heard it, and if they didn't appreciate his artistic efforts, they could find their own entertainment. Her laughter faded gradually, replaced by a wistful sadness. He had such big plans for our future. Silas, he was going to raise horses, breed them for the cavalry. He said we'd have 12 children and teach them all to ride before they could properly walk. You could still have children, Silas said carefully. Maybe not 12, but no. The word came out sharp and final. The raids, the time I spent wandering afterward, there were things that happened, things that damaged me. The doctor I finally saw in Tucson said I'd never be able to carry a child to term. The revelation hit Silas like a physical blow. No wonder she seemed so fragile, so convinced that she was somehow cursed. She'd lost not only the man she loved, but the future they'd planned together. I'm sorry, he said inadequately. I'm so sorry. Evelyn, don't be sorry for me, she replied with a bitter laugh. Be sorry for Gideon, who died believing he was going to have the family he'd always dreamed of. Be sorry for the children we'll never have, the life we'll never live. But you're still here, Silas said urgently. You survived, and that means something. That means you have a chance to build something new, something different but still worthwhile. She pulled her hand free from his and stood abruptly, pacing to the window where she stared out at the star-filled sky. You don't understand. I'm not the woman Gideon fell in love with anymore. That woman died with him in the desert. What's left is just remnants, broken pieces that don't fit together properly. Maybe, Silas said, rising to follow her. Or maybe you're just different now, changed by everything you've been through. That doesn't make you less valuable. Evelyn, it just makes you You. She turned to face him, and in the moonlight streaming through the window, he could see the war being fought behind her eyes, the desire to believe him battling against years of self-recrimination and despair. "How can you look at me and not see him?" she asked. "How can you touch me and not think about the fact that I was his first, that I belong to him completely? Because you're not his ghost." Silas replied simply, "You're a living woman who deserves a chance at happiness, regardless of what came before. Even if that happiness comes at his expense, even if choosing to live means letting him go. Especially then." Silas stepped closer, close enough to see the tears glistening on her cheeks. "Because holding on to grief so tightly that it stops you from living isn't love, Evelyn, it's fear. And what if I choose to live?" she whispered. "What if I try to build something new with you? What happens when you realize that every time you touch me, every time you kiss me, I'll be thinking of him? What happens when you understand that I'll never be able to love you the way I loved him?" The question hung in the air between them, brutal in its honesty. Silas felt something twist in his chest at her words, but he didn't step back, didn't retreat from the challenge she'd thrown down. "Then we'll find a different kind of love," he said finally. "Maybe not the first, overwhelming passion you shared with Gideon, but something real and solid and worth having nonetheless. You'd accept that? You'd be content with second place in my heart, if it meant you'd stay, if it meant you'd give us both a chance at something better than this loneliness we've been carrying. Yes, I'd accept that." For a moment, he thought she might step into his arms, might take the leap of faith he was offering. But then she shook her head and moved away from him, returning to her chair by the fire. "I can't," she said quietly. "I'm not ready. I may never be ready." "Then I'll wait," Silas said, settling back into his own chair. "For as long as it takes." "That's not fair to you. Let me worry about what's fair to me." They sat in silence for a while, watching the flames dance in the grate. Outside, a coyote howled somewhere in the distance, its voice lonely and wild in the vast darkness. The sound seemed to echo the ache in both their hearts, the longing for something that felt just out of reach. "Silas?" Evelyn said finally. "Yes? Thank you for listening, for not hating me, for everything. You don't need to thank me for doing what's right. Maybe not, but I'm going to anyway." She rose from her chair and paused beside his, resting her hand briefly on his shoulder. "Good night. Good night, Evelyn." He listened to her footsteps as she moved through the cabin, heard the soft click of her bedroom door closing. Then he was alone with the dying fire and the weight of everything that had been said and left unsaid. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for them to find their way toward something resembling peace. But tonight, for the first time since he'd found her broken and bleeding in the desert, Silas felt like they'd taken a real step forward. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. The next morning dawned with an oppressive weight that seemed to press down on the cabin like an invisible hand. Silas woke to find Evelyn already up and moving about the kitchen with a purposeful energy that immediately set him on edge. She had coffee brewing and breakfast nearly ready, but there was something different about her demeanor, a brittle brightness that felt forced and unnatural. "Morning," he said cautiously, pulling on his boots and running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Good morning," she replied without looking at him, her voice artificially cheerful. "I thought we might need an early start today. There's so much work to be done around here." Silas watched her bustling about, noting the way she avoided his eyes and kept her hands constantly busy. "Evelyn, about last night. Last night was exactly what it needed to be," she interrupted, finally turning to face him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We cleared the air, spoke honestly with each other. Now we can move forward." But over the following days, moving forward seemed to be the last thing either of them was doing. If anything, the brutal honesty of their conversation had created a new kind of tension between them. Not the uncertainty of secrets held, but the painful awareness of truths revealed. Evelyn threw herself into domestic projects with an almost manic intensity. She scrubbed every surface in the cabin until it gleamed, organized and reorganized the few belongings they possessed, and attacked the vegetable garden with such vigor that Silas worried she might damage the hardy plants that had survived the winter. Most significantly, she began working on things that belonged specifically to Gideon. She took down his extra shirt from its peg and spent an entire afternoon mending tiny tears and worn spots with meticulous care. She polished his old boots until the leather shone like new, then placed them carefully back by the door where he'd always kept them. The quilt that had covered his bed, a simple patchwork affair their mother had made years before, received similar attention, each square examined and reinforced where the threads had begun to fray. Silas found her one evening sitting by the fire with the quilt spread across her lap, her needle flashing in the lamplight as she worked to repair a section near one corner. "You don't have to do that," he said gently, settling into the chair across from her. "Yes, I do." Her voice was quiet but determined. "These are the last pieces of him that exist in this world. They deserve to be cared for properly." "Evelyn, don't!" She looked up at him then, and he was startled by the fierce protectiveness in her eyes. "Don't tell me it's not healthy, or that I'm dwelling on the past, or that I need to let go. I know all of those things are probably true, but I can't help myself. This is all I have left of him." "It's not all you have," Silas said carefully. "You have your memories of him, the love you shared." "Memories fade," she interrupted. "Love becomes just a word you use to describe something that used to exist. But this," she held up the section of quilt she'd been mending, "this he touched every night. This kept him warm when I couldn't be there to do it myself." Silas didn't know how to respond to that, so he simply watched her work, noting the precise, delicate stitches she used to repair the worn fabric. There was something almost ritualistic about her movements, as if she were performing some sacred duty that only she could understand. It was 3 days later that he woke to find her gone. The cabin felt empty in a way that went beyond simple absence. Silas knew immediately that she hadn't just stepped outside to tend the garden or check on Buck in his makeshift stable. There was a finality to the silence, a sense of something completed rather than temporarily interrupted. Her few possessions were gone from Gideon's room, the worn dress she'd arrived in, now clean and mended, the small bundle of undergarments he'd given her from his own meager supplies. But she'd left other things behind, things that made his throat tight with emotion. The vegetable garden had been meticulously weeded and watered, the hardy plants arranged in neat rows that would continue to provide food long after she was gone. The cabin itself was spotless, every surface clean and organized, as if she'd wanted to leave it in better condition than she'd found it. On the kitchen table, held down by the salt cellar, was a letter written in her careful, educated script. "Dearest Silas, by the time you read this, I will be gone. Please don't think this decision reflects any lack of gratitude for your kindness, or any failure on your part to make me feel welcome. You have been everything a woman could ask for in a protector and friend, and I will carry the memory of your generosity with me for the rest of my days. But I cannot stay in the place that was meant to be our home, Gideon's and mine. Every corner of this cabin holds dreams that will never come true, plans that will never be fulfilled. Living here would be like trying to inhabit a ghost, and I think that would be unfair to all of us, you, me, and Gideon's memory. I know you will think I'm being foolish, running away from the only safety I've known since that terrible day in the desert. Perhaps you're right, but I've realized that true healing can't happen in the shadow of what might have been. I need to find my own path, build my own life, even if that life is smaller and lonelier than what I once dreamed of having. Please don't come after me. I know your nature. Know that you'll want to protect me as you've protected me these past weeks. But this is something I must do alone. I've taken only what was mine when I arrived. Nothing that belonged to Gideon. Nothing that belongs to you. I've left his things as I found them, except for the repairs I made. I hope you'll forgive me for that presumption. Take care of yourself. Silas Maddox. You're a good man who deserves better than to be haunted by his brother's ghost. Find a woman who can love you with her whole heart, not just the pieces that aren't already buried in the past, with deepest affection and gratitude. Evelyn Rose Silas read the letter twice before the full implications sank in. Then he was moving, pulling on his coat and boots, checking Buck's tack with hands that shook slightly with urgency. The snow had been melting for days, turning the mountain trails into treacherous rivers of mud and slush. But he had to try to find her before she got too far from the relative safety of the high country. Buck seemed to sense his master's anxiety, stepping carefully but steadily through the worst of the muddy patches as they followed the main trail down toward the valley. Silas had no way of knowing which direction Evelyn had taken, but this route would eventually connect with the road to Prescott, and from there she could find transportation to anywhere in the territory. It was late afternoon when he finally caught sight of her. She was perhaps 2 miles ahead, a small figure struggling through ankle-deep mud with the determined gait of someone who had no choice but to keep moving forward. Even at this distance, he could see that she was having difficulty. The heavy ground was clearly taking its toll on her strength, and she was moving far more slowly than she probably intended. He was about to call out to her when he saw them 3 riders approaching from the opposite direction, their horses picking their way carefully along the treacherous trail. Something about their posture, the way they spread out as they drew closer to Evelyn, made ice form in Silas's stomach. Even from his distant vantage point, he could see Evelyn's reaction when she noticed the riders. She stopped walking and looked around desperately, but the trail at that point ran through an open meadow with no trees or rocks large enough to provide cover. She was completely exposed, with nowhere to run. Silas spurred Buck forward, pushing the gelding as fast as he dared on the unstable ground. But he was too far away, the distance too great to cover before the riders reached her. He watched in helpless fury as the 3 men surrounded Evelyn, their leader, a big man with a full beard and a battered hat, dismounting to approach her on foot. Even at this distance, Silas could see her backing away, her hands raised in a gesture that might have been pleading or self-defense. The conversation, whatever it was, didn't last long. The bearded man grabbed Evelyn's arm, and when she tried to pull away, he struck her hard enough to send her to her knees in the mud. The sound of her cry carried clearly across the meadow, high and desperate. That was when Silas's vision went red. He drove Buck forward at a reckless gallop, the rifle in his hands tracking toward the group of men as they hauled Evelyn upright. She was fighting them now, struggling with a fury that surprised her attackers but did little to improve her situation. One of the other men had dismounted and was working to tie her hands behind her back while their leader held her still. The first shot took the man holding the rope clean out of his saddle, the heavy .44 caliber bullet spinning him around and dropping him face first into the mud. The sound of the gunshot echoed across the meadow like thunder, and suddenly everyone was moving at once. The bearded leader released Evelyn and dove for his own rifle, while his remaining companion tried to control his frightened horse with one hand and draw his pistol with the other. Evelyn, freed from their grasp, stumbled backward and fell heavily, but she was smart enough to stay down and out of the line of fire. Silas's second shot went wide as Buck slipped in the treacherous footing, but it was close enough to make the mounted man think twice about his chances. He wheeled his horse around and spurred it toward the tree line, abandoning his companions without a backward glance. The bearded man was made of sterner stuff. He brought his rifle to his shoulder with practiced ease and sent a bullet whistling past Silas's ear, close enough that he felt the wind of its passage. But firing accurately from a prone position in the mud was difficult even for an experienced marksman, and his second shot went even wider than the first. Silas didn't give him a chance for a third. He slid from Buck's saddle while the horse was still moving, rolled to absorb the impact, and came up with his rifle already sighted. The bearded man was struggling to reload when Silas's bullet took him high in the chest, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying into the mud. The sudden silence that followed the gunfire was deafening. Smoke from the black powder charges hung in the still air like morning mist, and the acrid smell of cordite mixed with the earthy scent of churned mud and spring grass. Silas approached the fallen men carefully, his rifle ready for any sign of continued fight, but the man he'd shot from horseback was clearly dead, his eyes staring sightlessly at the gray sky. and the bearded leader was barely conscious, his breathing labored and blood frothing at the corners of his mouth. "Evelyn," Silas called, not taking his eyes off the wounded man. "Are you hurt?" "I don't think so," she replied shakily. "Just bruised. Silas, how did you—" "Later." He knelt beside the dying man, noting the spreading stain across his shirt front. The bullet had taken him through the lung, and from the sound of his breathing, there wasn't much time left. "Who are you? What did you want with her?" The bearded man's eyes focused on him with difficulty. "Bounty," he wheezed. "She's wanted reward money." "Wanted for what?" But the man's eyes were already glazing over, his breath coming in shorter and shorter gasps. Whatever crimes he thought Evelyn had committed, whatever bounty he'd hoped to collect, died with him in the mud of that lonely meadow. Silas stood slowly, his hands shaking slightly with the aftermath of violence. He'd killed men before, during his own military service, but it had been years since he'd taken a human life. The necessity of it didn't make it any easier to bear. "Silas," Evelyn's voice was small and frightened. "Are they really dead?" "Yes." He turned to look at her finally, noting the mud on her clothes, the red mark on her cheek where she'd been struck, the wide shock in her dark eyes. "It's over." She stared at the bodies for a long moment, then looked back at him. "You came after me. I told you not to, but you came anyway." "I couldn't let you go," he said simply. "Not like that, not alone and unprotected. But the letter, what I said about needing to find my own path, was the grief talking, not the woman I've come to know." He stepped closer, close enough to see the tears beginning to form in her eyes. "You don't have to carry this burden alone, Evelyn. You don't have to face the world without someone who cares about you." "But Gideon would want you to live," Silas finished firmly. "He would want you to be safe and happy, even if that happiness comes from someone else." She was crying openly now, the tears cutting clean tracks through the mud on her face. "I'm so tired of running," she whispered. "I'm so tired of being afraid all the time." "Then stop running," he said, reaching out to cup her face gently in his hands. "Come home with me. Let me protect you the way my brother would have wanted." For a moment, she just looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to judge the sincerity of his offer. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Yes," she said quietly. "I'd like to come home." As they rode back toward the cabin together, Evelyn seated behind him on Buck's broad back with her arms wrapped around his waist. Silas couldn't help but think that perhaps some things were meant to be salvaged from the wreckage of the past, not unchanged, not exactly as they had been before, but transformed into something new and precious in its own right. It wouldn't be the life Gideon had planned, but it would be a life nonetheless, and sometimes that was enough. The weeks that followed their return to the cabin passed in a strange, fragile peace. Evelyn seemed different somehow, not healed, exactly, but quieter in her grief, as if the violence in the meadow had shocked her into a new understanding of what truly mattered. She no longer spoke of leaving, but neither did she fully settle into the rhythm of their shared life. They worked side by side in companionable silence, tending the expanding garden as spring advanced into early summer, repairing winter damage to the cabin's roof and walls, and slowly building something that felt almost like a normal domestic routine, but beneath the surface, calm. Silas could sense her wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. It was during one of their quiet evening meals that she finally voiced what had been troubling her. "Those men," she said, setting down her fork and looking directly at him for the first time in days. "The ones who attacked me, that man said I was wanted, that there was bounty money." Silas had been dreading this conversation, but he met her gaze steadily. "What do you think he meant?" "I think he was talking about what happened at the settlement, after Gideon died." Her voice was calm, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. "There were accusations made, people looking for someone to blame for the failed escort mission. Some said I was a Confederate spy. that I deliberately led the Apache to the supply train. Were you? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that could destroy everything they'd been building together. But Evelyn didn't flinch from it. No, she said firmly. I was just a foolish girl in love, trying to help the man who meant everything to me. But in times like these, being foolish can look a lot like being treasonous, especially when people need someone to blame for their losses. Silas nodded slowly. He'd seen enough of military justice during his own service to know how quickly suspicion could become accusation. Accusation could become conviction. So you ran. I ran, she confirmed. What else could I do? Stay and try to convince a military tribunal that I wasn't a spy? Hope that my word would be enough against the testimony of men who'd lost friends in that raid? You could have come here sooner, found me, told me the truth. She was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands. I was afraid you'd believe them. Afraid you'd see me as the woman who got your brother killed and turn me away. And now I'm still afraid, she admitted. But I'm tired of running from shadows and rumors. I'm tired of looking over my shoulder, waiting for the past to catch up with me. The next morning, Silas saddled Buck and rode down to Prescott, leaving Evelyn with strict instructions to keep the rifle close and not to open the door for anyone she didn't know. The territorial capital was bustling with its usual mix of miners, ranchers, soldiers, and merchants, but Silas had come with a specific purpose. The military telegraph office was housed in a modest building near the territorial government offices, and it took most of the morning and a substantial portion of his savings to send detailed inquiries to the appropriate authorities. He wanted to know exactly what charges, if any, had been filed against Evelyn Rose in connection with the Apache raid that had killed his brother. The response came 3 days later, and it was better than he'd dared to hope. No formal charges had ever been filed. The initial investigation had concluded that the raid was simply one of many random attacks that had plagued the territory during that period, with no evidence of inside information or deliberate betrayal. Evelyn's name appeared in the reports only as a witness who had fled the scene and could not be located for questioning. Moreover, the bounty hunters who had attacked her appeared to have been operating on outdated and inaccurate information, possibly motivated more by desperation than by any legitimate warrant. When Silas shared this news with Evelyn that evening, he watched years of fear and guilt drain from her face like water from a broken dam. "It's over?" she asked, hardly daring to believe it. "It's over," he confirmed. "You're free to live your life without looking over your shoulder." She was quiet for a long time, absorbing the implications of this freedom. Finally, she looked up at him with something approaching hope in her dark eyes. "What does that mean for us?" she asked quietly. It was the question Silas had been asking himself for weeks, the question that lay at the heart of everything they'd been building together. He chose his words carefully. "It means we can make a real choice," he said, "not based on fear or necessity or guilt, but on what we actually want for our futures." "And what do you want?" The directness of the question caught him off guard, but he didn't hesitate to answer. "I want you to stay. I want us to build a life together, here in this place that was meant to be a home for people who care about each other. Even though you'll never be first in my heart, even though," he confirmed, "I've made my peace with sharing your heart with Gideon's memory. I'd rather have part of you than all of someone else." That night, for the first time since she'd returned from her attempted flight, Evelyn came to him instead of retreating to the solitude of Gideon's old room. She moved quietly through the cabin in the darkness, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor, and appeared beside his bed like a ghost made flesh. "Silas," she whispered, "are you awake?" "I am now." He sat up, making room for her on the narrow mattress. "What is it?" Instead of answering, she climbed into bed beside him, settling against his side with a trust that made his throat tight with emotion. For a few moments, they simply held each other in the darkness, two damaged souls seeking comfort in physical closeness. "I want to try," she said finally, her voice muffled against his chest. I want to try to build something new with you, something that honors what Gideon and I had but doesn't live entirely in its shadow. Are you sure? No, she admitted. I'm not sure of anything anymore, but I'm tired of being alone, and I care about you more than I thought I was still capable of caring about anyone. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was honest, and Silas found that honesty more valuable than any pretty words might have been. They made love that night with a tenderness born of mutual recognition. Two people who had both lost everything and found each other in the wreckage. The summer months that followed brought a contentment neither of them had expected. They worked together to expand the cabin, adding a proper kitchen and a larger main room that felt less like a bachelor's retreat and more like a family home. Evelyn's garden flourished under her careful attention, providing not only vegetables for their table, but the flowers Gideon had once promised her. Word of their arrangement gradually spread through the scattered community of ranchers and miners who called the high country home, and reactions were mixed. Some neighbors offered quiet support, understanding that loneliness was a luxury few could afford in such a harsh land. Others were more judgmental, viewing their relationship as somehow improper given Evelyn's connection to Gideon. The criticism came to a head in late August when Reverend Samuel Morrison, the circuit preacher who served the mountain communities, arrived for one of his irregular visits to the area. Silas had been expecting this conversation since the day he decided to let Evelyn stay, and he met it head-on. "Mr. Maddox," the Reverend began without preamble, "I've been hearing troubling reports about your living situation." "What kind of reports?" Silas asked, though he already knew the answer. "That you're harboring a woman of questionable character, that you're living in sin without the sanction of marriage or even basic propriety." Morrison was a thin, severe man with steel-gray hair and the kind of moral certainty that brooked no argument. "The community is concerned about the example you're setting. The community can tend to its own affairs." Silas replied calmly, "What happens in my home is nobody's business but mine and Miss Rose's." Miss Rose. The Reverend's tone made the name sound like a curse. "Yes, I've heard about her as well. A woman who brings violence and disruption wherever she goes, who was involved somehow in military matters that got good soldiers killed." Silas felt his temper flare, but he kept his voice level. "Those are lies. Reverend, Miss Rose has been cleared of any wrongdoing by the territorial authorities. Perhaps by earthly authorities." Morrison replied coldly. "But what about divine justice? What about the moral implications of a woman who was pledged to one brother taking up with another after his death? She was never pledged to my brother in the eyes of the law. But in the eyes of God? In the natural order of things?" The Reverend leaned forward, his pale eyes burning with righteous conviction. "This woman brings chaos. Mr. Maddox, death follows her like a plague. First your brother, then those men who died in the meadow. How many more will fall before you come to your senses?" It was Evelyn's soft voice from the cabin doorway that ended the conversation. "You're right, Reverend," she said quietly, stepping into view. "I do seem to bring trouble wherever I go, but I'm trying to change that. Trying to build something positive instead of just surviving from day to day." Morrison looked her up and down with obvious distaste. "And you think living in sin with a dead man's brother is the way to do that?" "I think," Evelyn replied with dignity, "that two people who care about each other and are trying to make a decent life together deserve the same respect as anyone else, regardless of their past circumstances. Respect is earned, young woman. And from what I've heard, from what you've heard," Silas interrupted, his patience finally exhausted. "You've formed opinions about people and situations you know nothing about. I suggest you move along. Reverend, you're not welcome here." Morrison's face flushed red with anger, but he was wise enough to recognize the finality in Silas's tone. "The community will hear about this," he warned as he gathered his hat and coat. "People will know what kind of man you've become. Let them know," Silas replied, "and let them know that anyone who wants to question my choices can come discuss it with me, personally." After the Reverend had gone, Silas and Evelyn stood together on the cabin's front porch, watching his buggy disappear down the mountain trail. He's right about one thing, Evelyn said finally. We are living in sin by the standards of most people. Does that bother you? She considered the question seriously. It bothers me that our happiness seems to offend people, that they think they have the right to judge how we've chosen to heal our wounds. She turned to look at him. But if you're asking whether I think we're doing something wrong, the answer is no. What we have together feels honest and good, even if it doesn't fit into neat categories. Then that's all that matters. But even as he said the words, Silas knew their troubles with the community were far from over. The Reverend's visit had been a warning shot, and he had no doubt that more pressure would follow. The question was whether their still fragile relationship could withstand the scrutiny and disapproval that was coming their way. As if reading his thoughts, Evelyn slipped her hand into his and squeezed gently. Whatever comes, she said quietly, we'll face it together. It was a promise that would be tested sooner than either of them expected. The winter of 1890 arrived early in the high country, blanketing the mountains in snow by the middle of October and settling in with the kind of bone-deep cold that made every breath visible and every step deliberate. But inside the expanded cabin, warmth radiated from more than just the crackling fireplace. Evelyn had been feeling poorly for several weeks, plagued by morning sickness that left her pale and shaky until well past noon. At first, she'd attributed it to something she'd eaten or perhaps the stress of the community's continued disapproval. But as the symptoms persisted and certain other signs became impossible to ignore, the truth gradually dawned on both of them. It's not possible, she whispered one evening as she sat wrapped in quilts by the fire, her hand pressed protectively to her still flat stomach. The doctor in Tucson said I'd never be able to carry a child. Silas knelt beside her chair, covering her hand with his own. Doctors have been wrong before, he said gently. And sometimes what seems impossible becomes possible when conditions change. She looked at him with wonder and terror warring in her dark eyes. What if something goes wrong? What if I lose it? Then we'll grieve and heal together, just like we've done with everything else. But for now, let's focus on taking care of you and this little miracle you're carrying. The pregnancy progressed slowly but steadily through the harsh winter months. Evelyn's body, strengthened by months of good food and peaceful living, seemed to be adapting to its new burden far better than anyone had dared to hope. The morning sickness gradually faded, replaced by a gentle rounding of her figure and a luminous quality to her skin that made Silas catch his breath when he looked at her. More significantly, the nightmares that had plagued her since Gideon's death began to fade as well. She still spoke his name occasionally in her sleep, but now it was with fondness rather than anguish, as if she were sharing news with an old friend rather than pleading with a ghost. I dreamed about him last night, she told Silas one morning in early spring as they worked together to prepare the garden for planting. But it was different this time. He was standing in that meadow where we used to pick wildflowers together, and he was smiling. What did he say? He said he was proud of me for choosing to live instead of just surviving. And he said... She paused, her hand moving instinctively to the small swell of her belly. He said to tell you that he's grateful you're taking care of his family. Silas felt his throat tighten with emotion. His family? That's what he called us, you, me, and the baby. He said we're all part of the same story, connected by love even if it's not the kind of love anyone expected. As spring advanced into summer and Evelyn's pregnancy became impossible to hide, the pressure from the community intensified. Women crossed the street to avoid speaking to her when she accompanied Silas to town for supplies. Men who had once been friendly to Silas now treated him with cold politeness at best, open hostility at worst. The situation came to a head in July when a delegation of prominent townspeople, led by Reverend Morrison, arrived at the cabin uninvited and unannounced. Mr. Maddox, the Reverend announced without preamble, we've come to make you an offer. Silas stepped out onto the porch, positioning himself between the visitors and the door behind which Evelyn was resting. What kind of offer? The kind that could save your reputation and provide for Miss Rose's future at the same time. Morrison's voice carried the oily smoothness of a man who believed he was doing God's work. We're prepared to arrange passage for her to California, where she can have the child in anonymity and find suitable employment afterward. In exchange, you'll publicly acknowledge your mistake and return to respectable society. And if I refuse, then you'll find it increasingly difficult to conduct business in this territory. Banks don't lend to men of questionable character. Stores don't extend credit to those who flaunt community standards. You'll be effectively ostracized. Before Silas could respond, the cabin door opened and Evelyn stepped onto the porch beside him. Her pregnancy was clearly visible now, her dress carefully tailored to accommodate her changing shape. But she carried herself with a dignity that made the delegation shift uncomfortably. "Gentlemen," she said calmly, "I couldn't help but overhear your generous offer, but I'm afraid I must decline." "Young woman," Morrison began pompously, "you don't understand the gravity of your situation. An unmarried woman with a child faces a very difficult future." "Who says I'm unmarried?" Evelyn interrupted, slipping her hand into Silas's and holding it up so the simple gold band on her finger caught the sunlight. The Reverend's face went white, then red. "When? Where? I perform no such ceremony." "Reverend John Wesley Cooper of the Pine Creek Methodist Church," Silas replied smoothly, naming a preacher he'd known during his military service. 2 weeks ago, in a private ceremony with witnesses. It was a lie, but a plausible one. And the delegation had no way to verify it without sending someone on a week-long journey to Pine Creek. More importantly, it robbed them of their primary ammunition against the couple. "Even so," one of the other men protested, the timing suggests that two people who've been through tragedy and loss found each other and decided to build a life together." Evelyn said firmly, "If that offends your sensibilities, gentlemen, I suggest you examine your own hearts for the source of that offense." After the delegation had departed in frustrated defeat, Silas and Evelyn stood together on the porch, watching the dust settle on the mountain trail. "That was well done," Silas said admiringly. "But we'll have to make it true eventually. Find a preacher willing to perform a quiet ceremony. Make the marriage legal." "Is that a proposal?" Evelyn asked with a small smile. "I suppose it is. Not the most romantic one in history, but it's perfect," she interrupted, standing on her toes to kiss him gently. "Because it's honest, and it's based on who we are now, not who we used to be." They were married 3 weeks later by a young minister in the settlement of Flagstaff, with 2 strangers from the street serving as witnesses. It wasn't the wedding either of them had once imagined, but it was theirs, and that made it precious. The baby arrived in early October, just as the aspens were turning gold in the high country. Labor came hard and fast, leaving little time for the mountain doctor Silas had arranged to be present. Instead, it was Evelyn's friend Martha Wilson from the next valley over who served as midwife, her capable hands guiding the child into the world while Silas paced the cabin's main room like a caged animal. When Martha finally emerged from the bedroom, her face shining with joy and exhaustion, she was carrying a small, squalling bundle wrapped in one of Evelyn's carefully mended quilts. "It's a girl," she announced, placing the baby in Silas's trembling arms. Small but healthy, with a fine set of lungs on her. Silas looked down at his daughter, for she was his daughter in every way that mattered, and felt his heart expand to accommodate a love he hadn't known was possible. She had Evelyn's dark hair and delicate features, but her eyes, when they opened briefly, were the clear blue of mountain sky. "Have you chosen a name?" Martha asked. Silas looked toward the bedroom door, where he could see Evelyn propped against pillows, her face pale but radiant with joy. Evelyn wanted to call her Hope. He said, "Hope Maddox." "Hope," Martha repeated approvingly. "That's fitting, given everything you two have been through." As the months passed and Hope grew from a tiny, helpless bundle into a bright, curious infant, something magical happened in the cabin on the mountain. The last shadows of the past seemed to lift, replaced by the simple, profound joy of watching a child discover the world. Evelyn proved to be a natural mother, patient and nurturing despite her lack of experience. More surprisingly, she began to speak of Gideon not with pain, but with gratitude, as if his memory had been transformed from a source of guilt into a wellspring of strength. "Sometimes I think he sent her to us," she said one evening as she nursed Hope by the fireplace, while Silas read aloud from one of their few books, "as if he knew we needed something to bind us together, something that was purely ours." "Do you think he'd approve?" Silas asked. "I think he'd be happy that his family is safe and loved," she replied. "And I think he'd be proud of the man his brother has become." One morning in late spring, a letter arrived that would change their understanding of everything that had come before. It was from the War Department, officially notifying them that additional evidence had been found regarding Sergeant Gideon Maddox's final mission. According to a survivor who had only recently come forward, Gideon had died not in a random Apache raid, but while deliberately drawing enemy fire away from wounded civilians, including a young woman who had been helping to tend the injured. His actions had saved at least 6 lives, and he was being posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for extraordinary heroism. The letter also included a small package, a locket that had been found among Gideon's personal effects, containing a carefully braided strand of chestnut-brown hair. Evelyn held the locket with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face as she read the citation that finally, officially, cleared her of any blame in her beloved's death. "He saved them," she whispered. "All those people lived because of what he did." "Including you," Silas said gently. "He saved you, and that made everything else possible." That evening, as they sat on the cabin's expanded porch, watching Hope take her first unsteady steps in the garden where Evelyn grew her flowers, a sense of completeness settled over them like a benediction. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but no longer frightening. There would be challenges, the harsh mountain winters, the struggle to make a living from unforgiving land, the need to protect their small family from a world that could still be cruel to those who didn't fit conventional molds. But they would face those challenges together, bound by a love that had grown from ashes and loss into something stronger and more enduring than either had thought possible. Hope laughed as she tumbled into the soft grass, and the sound carried across the mountain meadows like a promise that tomorrow would be better than today. "Look at her," Evelyn said softly, watching their daughter push herself back to her feet with determined concentration. "She doesn't know that anything is supposed to be impossible." "Maybe that's the point," Silas replied, pulling his wife closer to his side. "Maybe hope is just another word for refusing to believe that impossible means forever." As the sun set behind the peaks and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the little family settled into the rhythm of another peaceful evening. Their story now one of healing rather than loss, of love that had learned to bloom again after the harshest of winters. Thank you for listening to this tale from the Wild West, where love found a way to heal even the deepest wounds. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to this story? Whether you're by your own campfire, on a long drive, or just settling in for the evening, drop a comment below and let me know. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories of romance, adventure, and redemption from the American frontier. And share your thoughts about Silas and Evelyn's journey. Until our trails cross again, may your own story be filled with hope and second chances.